Welcome back, everyone, to the Doctor Will See You Now. I know it's been a little while since we've been on chatting with criminal authors and their amazing writing, but we're back, and what a way to come back into the consultation room than to welcome somebody that I got to know before they were published, and then it's also it's such an excitement when someone almost in a previous iteration, then you see their book come out, and what a fabulous book. I would just say, if you are fond of historical writing and fond of historical crime fiction, then this is a book you really need to get hold of, because you will be truly transported in every sense of the word. But I'll stop rambling, and I will say a very warm welcome into the studio to Davy Bishop, who I shall now call David, if that's okay. Welcome, David. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, and thank you for the effusive welcoming. Shall I just take my clothes off now, or sort of?
I think probably we'll say that until the end, if that's all right. No.
We'll start with the verbal probing first.
Indeed. And just to introduce you to viewers who may not be familiar with you or your work, Davy Bishop is the author of the Cesare Aldo Mysteries, set in Renaissance Florence. And so on hearing that, you can probably tell why I'm excited about this book, published by Pan Macmillan. And as I say, I'm going to call him David rather than DV, which seems ever so sort of like distant for this kind of chat that we have. But David is an award-winning screenwriter and TV dramatist. His love for the city of Florence and the Renaissance period meant that, of course, there could be only one setting for his crime fiction debut. This mystery, The City of Vengeance, won the Pitch Perfect competition at the Bloody Scotland Crime Fiction Festival in 2018. David's also been awarded with the Robert Louis Stevenson Fellowship by the Scottish Book Trust while writing the novel. And he's programme leader for creative writing at Edinburgh Napier University. And I think lots of exciting things to talk about in that introduction, but I think best of all, he's currently finishing the second novel. So get into that first one, because the second one is on the way. David, if we can start off, I'm just keen to know how long have you been teaching creative writing, and that leap from being someone who leads others in that to you then writing your own crime fiction?
Okay, so I started the program, helped start the program in 2009 at Edinburgh Napier, and I created the program with my colleague at the time, Sam Boyce, who was a literary agent in London and has been around in the Scottish literary scene for quite a bit of time. And when we were starting the program, we very much wanted to make sure it was a program that was about genre fiction, popular genre fiction, rather than sort of literary fiction and poetry, because there are hundreds of programs that you can go to if you want to do literary fiction and poetry, and it's no blight on them whatsoever. But we wanted to do something that had its own, that's a terrible term, USP, its unique selling point, but also it's the area that we wanted to work in and where we had some expertise. So I started teaching in 2009, having always sworn I would never become a teacher. My mother was a teacher, and it just struck me as a lifetime of perpetual homework. It was bad enough I was already a writer working from home who already had all the homework they needed, and then throw teaching into the mix as well. But I saw the job came up, and it sort of ticked everything I'd ever done in my career to that point. And I thought, oh, I'll give it a go, and then stumbled into teaching, and found I quite enjoyed it. I was a freelance writer before I went into teaching, and before that I was a comics editor. So I worked on 2000 AD and Judge Dredd and some of the great venerable British comics. And the thing I actually loved most about being a comics editor, aside from the amazing stories and artwork, was actually finding new talent, new writers and new artists, and helping them develop their talent and hone their craft. So teaching sort of was a bit full circle for me in that regard. And as to the crime fiction part of it, I mean, I'd written almost every other genre and almost every other medium aside from prose crime fiction. You know, I'd written Doctors on BBC One, which is a drama series, radio plays, comics, graphic novels, computer games, and a lot of tie-in novels. So things like Doctor Who and Nightmare on Elm Street and all sorts of random things. Quite the scattershot career. And almost all the time when I was writing all these other things, I was constantly smuggling crime and mysteries into my stories. Because for me, crime is the great narrative engine. If you've got a mystery, if there's a puzzle to solve, then that's it. You've already got structure is almost handed to you on the plate. You just need to finesse it. So I spent a lot of time not writing crime, and finally I said, oh, just come out of the closet and admit you're a crime writer and do it properly, for goodness sakes, instead of mucking about in the sidelines and sort of sidling up towards it. I thought, come on, just write a crime novel, for goodness sakes. And then it was where to set it, when to set it, and what sort of story I wanted to tell. So I spent all the time I've been doing all these other things. I had been researching Renaissance Florence because I picked up this particular book, which he brandishes. It's called Criminal Justice and Crime in Late Renaissance Florence, which is published by the Cambridge University Press, and it's somebody's monograph.
Where did you come across that book?
I picked it up in a remaindered bookshop around the corner from the British Museum in London in the late 90s. This is how long I have not been writing City of Vengeance. And there was one phrase in it, which I can probably even find it. I think I've turned the corner over to preserve it forevermore. It says, their organization in the 16th century was roughly comparable to that of a modern police force, which is what the criminal justice system was in Florence at this time. There's a lot of people will tell you, well, we didn't really have police before sort of the Victorians. And no, not actually the case. There were places, and Renaissance Florence is one of them, where they had this massive bureaucracy, and part of that was a quite complex criminal justice system, which, as the book says, is roughly comparable to a modern police force. So that sort of once I read that phrase in that monograph, and I went, oh, that if I was ever going to write a crime novel, that's the one I want to write. Renaissance Florence mystery.
Do you know, I'm struck by the fact that that book was in your possession, you know, and has been there for quite a while. And as you say, you know, the way that maybe a process or a journey with our publication that comes out isn't necessarily that something that seems straightforward, isn't necessarily a quick fix, but that, you know, it almost seems like a magical moment that you should come across that book back then, and here we are now discussing, and I must say I am just bowled over by the display. I love what you've done with City of Vengeance and the twinkly lights there. Lovely. If we just stop a minute in Florence, would that we could. Were you familiar with Florence as a place to visit before you began developing this novel? You know, I'm thinking, were there certain roads that came together, or did you then go visit Florence once you began on the journey writing the book?
Oh, I was visiting. I mean, as I say, I spent years not writing the book because I wanted to be a good enough writer to do it justice. I wanted to be able to, because I've written a lot of different things in over the years, some better than others. And I knew if I was going to write an original crime novel, I was going to have my name on the cover. I wanted it to be the best book I could possibly do. And having decided I was going to set it in Renaissance Florence, I then went, I actually know almost nothing about Renaissance Florence beyond the most limited tourist version of it. Oh, they've got the David, it has amazing art and architecture, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Botticelli. And then maybe some people know about things like Machiavelli's The Prince, and therefore maybe the Medicis. They know it's the sort of balance of art and architecture and yet sort of political backstabbing manipulation. So it's this weird contradiction in terms of as a city and a setting. So I had the very, you know, the postcard version of that in my head. So I thought, I need to find out a lot more before I can even attempt to write this book, because, you know, I've written science fiction, but really that's more like a set dressing in which I just tell a story. I've written other genres where really I'm writing the story I want to tell. And the fact that there are, I don't know, elves wandering past in the background doesn't really hide the fact that I'm writing fantasy that's really just Hill Street Blues transplanted to the world of Games Workshop Warhammer. So I wanted to do it justice. But then that's the challenge of trying to learn everything, because you want to, you want to feel like you want that authenticity. When you pick up historical fiction, you want to absolutely believe that you're being transported to the location and it feels real. You know, you can have the full sensory experience. You can smell the smells. You can picture yourself walking down the street. Know that if you turn right, you will see X. If you turn left, you will see Y. In the case, what people are wearing, the whole thing. So you want to transport your reader there. So you need to do all the historical research, and then you need to sort of do the social research of what life was like for your average, you know, Giuseppe walking along the streets of Florence, so that then when you write the story, you can do that and make it all seem effortless. Because all that research, almost none of it goes on the page, of course. You know, the best historical research, best historical fiction for me, isn't one where we walk into a room and then stop to describe every single piece of furniture and tapestry on the wall and everything else, because the story grinds to a halt. And if nothing else, my writing is about, there's a strong sense of pace to it. So it's a propulsive narrative. It's not a lot of stop and, you know, admire the frescoes. That's not quite my style.
Yeah, thinking about the style, you talk about that style that you've developed, and it makes me wonder of, you know, that creative writing lecturer who helps and instructs and advises others in their process and creation. Are you able to do that for yourself? I mean, you know, can you be too, you know, like split personality of the one who offers, you know, advice and the one who needs that advice? Or do you have you turned to other people to do that for you as you've created your own work?
I mean, I think it's the challenge for every writer, is to balance the two voices in your head. There's the sort of the more pure creative voice that just says, go, 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 this happens next, and then this, and then this, and this, and this. And that's great. And, you know, when the horse is going, you don't want to stop or slow down, because you're like, let's just, inspiration has arrived, let's keep going as long as it lasts. And then, you know, you need to know yourself as a writer and what your limitations are. And if you get past a certain point in a day, whether it's 500 words or 1500, then after that, everything after that is just mince. You know, it's just rubbish coming out. So you know your limitations. And so you have the creative head that's going, and then a bit like Wessel Gummidge, you have the separate head, which is the editorial head, which is the one that's the analytical brain. And the one that says, oh, this isn't working very well, maybe take your foot off the gas and think about, is the scene actually serving its purpose? Is it advancing the story? Is it revealing character? What is this? What purpose is this serving? So there'll be times when I was writing City of Vengeance, there's something I never thought I would include in a book, which was dream sequences. So there's a dream sequence in the book because my protagonist, my sleuth, Cesare Aldo, takes quite a battering through the course of the book. It has to be said, he has a bit of a hard time of it. And there are a couple of occasions where he's battered nonsensical. Well, there's one where he's nonsensical, or he's like close to death and he hallucinated. So there's a dream sequence where he pictures himself back and he visits his father on his father's deathbed. And I was writing this, and I was writing it quite happily, and I'd gone past 1,000 words of this dream sequence, and the editorial voice was just saying to me, you know, this is never going to make it all into the book, don't you? But I'm just like, yeah, it's fine. I know I will, shut up, editor head. I will come back and fix this later, but while it's going, I'm going to keep going because, you know, I've got my word count I need to get for today. So let's write this and I can fix it later. So it's that balancing act of the editorial head, the analytical head, that ability to step back and recognize what's going wrong versus the let's just create, that pure primal urge. And so the creative writer lecture in me is very much the editorial head that's going, is this really working? And then, of course, you have every writer I know has the third voice, which is the you're not very good at this, are you? You're terrible. You're going to get found out. This is, the old imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to balance all of these, and it's the difference between just your natural insecurity as a creative individual and the analytical part of your brain that's telling you, stop, this isn't working, back up, and let's have another go at this. So it's trying to figure out, is it just insecurity? Is it actually good process that's telling me not to do this? Or should I just let the horse have its rush? In a slightly convoluted metaphor, I seem to have trotted out. Oh God, I've done it now. That's
you done it again. I see what you did there. But to look at the display there, that combination so far has worked. A book has been produced, and not only just produced, but a book has been published, and I think so far so good. But we know there's a second on the way, which is really exciting. But if we haven't yet got into City of Vengeance, you've mentioned already your main protagonist, Cesare Aldo. So without giving too much away, of course, introduce us to him, and what, as you've created this character, and is still being created, of course, because a series is emerging. What do you like about this character? What is it that's warmed you to think, I want to keep writing about this man?
Ooh, good question. Okay. Aldo has an absolute moral core and code, if you will. There are things that he will and won't do. He values loyalty. He really struggles with trust, to trust other people. Aldo is what today we would call a gay man, but at a time and place in history where that makes him a criminal, and yet he's enforcing the law, a law that says that the performance of his sexuality is punishable by death, potentially. So he has this tension in his life that he struggles with, trying to find the balance between who he trusts, what he will and won't do, and what he's willing to do. He's shrewd, but he's also quite intelligent. He's very analytical. So he's able to sort of see past the lies of others, because he has to live a series of lies himself a lot of the time. He's very canny. You don't pull the wool over Aldo's eyes very easily. He's got a slightly dry sense of humor. And yeah, I mean, it's when I was writing City of Vengeance, I was conscious of the fact that he was a gay man at this particular time and place in history. But I hadn't really thought about how I was going to make that manifest in the book, how I was going to make that apparent. And there was a scene in the story, in the novel, he investigates a murder in the Jewish community. So he has to go and knock on doors and ask if anybody's seen anything. And he knocks on the door of the Jewish community's doctor, Saul Orvieto. And sort of Saul appears at the door, and he offers to shake his hand, and it's covered in blood because he's busy experimenting on a goat in the back room, because he wants to learn more about how animals function. And so Aldo follows him into his examining room, his workshop, and then just starts admiring the sort of the broadness of his shoulders and the warmth of his hazel eyes. And I was like, well, this wasn't in the plan for the novel, but oh well, let's go with it and see what happens. And the two of them, while the doctor's demonstrating how the dead person was stabbed to death, says, oh, do you mind if I just, mime stabbing you to death? And I was like, no, fine, carry on. So the doctor's about to, sort of got the chest up, the knife up to the chest, and they're like nose to nose. And I'm like, whoa, getting a bit hot and heavy here. None of which was in my plan for the book, but I went, no, actually, this is exactly the sort of person that Aldo would fall for. Somebody who's, intelligent and inquisitive and is in some ways a mirror of certain aspects of his own personality, but somebody who's probably slightly more at ease with themselves than Aldo can be at times. So yeah, I like Aldo. There's a lot to unpick with Aldo. He's the illegitimate son of a noble merchant and a servant or a slave girl. We've yet to determine that. He was kicked out of the family home when his father died by his evil stepmother Lucrezia. Had to survive on the streets as a teenage boy, became a mercenary, and then became a law enforcer. So before we meet him, I think he's 38 in City of Vengeance. He was conceived up a dark alley while the bonfire of vanities was burning in the main square of Florence. We've yet to witness that particular sequence because that will be in the backstory. So he's actually lived at this point for the period quite a long and varied life, and there's more to come, obviously. So yes.
I love that you mentioned that tension that sits within him of being the law enforcer, of being on one side of the law, and yet for simply being who he is, were he to follow his passions, he would sit squarely on the other side of the law. I like that. And I also liked what you said, because I think it's so important. And I try to always talk about this with my students. We have terminology that we can use in the 21st century, that when we go to another historical time period, that terminology may not be relevant, or there may be a different terminology. And I just wondered, doing the research into, as you say, somebody that we would probably talk about as a gay man, but back in Florence at that time, was there a rich seam of information to be found, or is it one that is still shrouded, in mists, with it being being illegal?
Yeah. Actually, no. There's one particular text which was hugely helpful. It's here on the shelf here. It's Forbidden Friendships by an academic, I think, called Rock or Roque. I don't know how you say their name. Which was about they had dug into the papers of the time because Renaissance Florence, we don't think of it because we think of art and history, and all the rest. It was actually a massive bureaucracy. I mean, we're talking like, Sir Humphrey Appleby level of bureaucracy. It's a complete subversion. They had dozens of different courts, for example, which had responsibility for different things. They had the Office of Decency, which was responsible for the regulation of sex working. They had a court just for the control of salt. They had this bizarre labyrinth and Byzantine bureaucracy. There was a civil servant for everything, and endless layers and sort of managers and under managers and under secretarios and all this. So there isn't, despite the many wars and the many floods that Florence has suffered over the years, a lot of these papers still survive. So people are able to go into the state's archives left over from the Tuscan state of the time and read the court files, which is where a lot of things like the criminal justice monograph I mentioned earlier and Forbidden Friendships went into the files and then looked through the court transcripts and said, oh, right, so this is what was going on. I mean, Florence at this period in history was to be called a Florentine outside of Florence was basically to be called a homosexual. It was Florence was a metaphor, was deemed to be the sort of den of homosexuality and iniquity and sin that was all going to burn to the ground any second. It wasn't a papal city, unlike places like Bologna and other parts of Italy, because it was run by merchants and business and banking. So it was a slightly unholy city in some ways. And there was an entire gay subculture, as we would call it now. So there was, if you wanted to attract the attention of another man, then you knocked his cap off or you stole his cap away and he had to reclaim his cap. So there's the whole series of signals and other things. There's particular side streets that were very popular. There were inns and taverns that specialized, were basically gay bars of the time. So there's actually a lot of information exists about it. But yeah, the terminology of today didn't apply. There's aspects of it, and there was things that we would recognize today, and we would be able to put names or labels on them. And people were still doing those 500 years ago. They just didn't have current terminology for it. So yes, if you were a gay man, then you were a sodomite, was sort of the way it was termed, or in Italian, a buggeroni was the other term for it. Charming, that was a term of abuse, obviously. So yes, that's one particular character is very anti-gay in the book, and is Aldo clashes with them for all sorts of reasons.
Thank you for that. There is another murder to solve, is there not, in the book as well? I think there's you run two there, and I just wondered why you chose that duality within the text.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect that it stems from, I mean, at a narrative level, it stems from having worked in TV and other places. So when you write for a show like Doctors, for instance, which is what's called continuing drama, but it has a story of the day, which is the equivalent of the sort of the plot of the novel, if you like. It's the A story. And then on Doctors, they give you the B and the C story, the subplots, which are the sort of the regular soapy bits of who's busy having sex with who and why, and who's angry with whom amongst the regulars. So I was used to the idea of having a big A story and then another plot running alongside it, because it always gives you somewhere to cut away to, and gives you something else to do, which is a great way to help keep up the pace, because you cut away from the A story at a moment of extreme tension, go to the B story, we follow that, and then you ramp that one up and you cut back to A, having skipped over the dull bits, which is always helpful. As you know, like Elmore Leonard says, the sainted Elmore Leonard, leave out the boring bits that the reader won't read. So that's one of the reasons why. Also, the sort of what you could call the other murder, the B story in City of Vengeance, it forces Aldo to act in order to protect himself. He's forced to intervene. It's not his case, as it were, but he's forced to intervene to protect himself, because if his sexuality did fall into the hands of his enemies, then they could destroy him with it. So that's the ongoing tension that runs through the book. And then there's a third strand, just because I like a little bit of extra grist in the mill, which is that in the process of Aldo's investigation of the murder in the Jewish community, he uncovers a conspiracy to overthrow the Duke of Florence, Duke Alessandro de' Medici, which is based on real events, which is that's the historical core of the book. So he is essentially he's got a handful of days to try and solve the murder and stop the conspiracy, which, you know, in narrative terms is a good old ticking clock. You can't go wrong with a ticking clock to keep the pace up.
Because I wondered, you know, that idea of he must solve the murder that he's looking into. He must solve it before Epiphany. And I wondered, you know, was there some sort of legal, you know, legal cutoff point that if cases aren't solved before Epiphany, then then people are, you know, home free, or was it just that choice, as you say, to have that ticking clock that puts that pressure on?
Yeah, I mean, well, the reason he gets the pressure's put on him to solve it by the Feast of Epiphany because it's immediately after Christmas, and then there's a tension operating between there's a militia who exists within the city of Florence, but they're all out of town at this point, and they're all due back because the captain of the militia is called Alessandro Vitelli. He's due back immediately after Epiphany. That's when he's coming back from his country estate. So that's used as basically a device to put pressure on Aldo to solve the case for reasons that become apparent through the course of the book. But no, I don't. It's not like they weren't about to sort of set free the criminals or anything like that. It's not not one of those things. They actually do. It is there were on certain feast days in Renaissance France, they did release some prisoners for Easter, and I think it's the Feast of St. John, I think, from memory off the top of my head. So there were certain dates in the year where they released prisoners from their cells to mark a feast day for whatever reason. But that was all, like everything in Florence, everything was highly political. There was always some political undercurrent. It was always a maneuver that somebody was doing against somebody else in order to control or seize control of whatever it was they were aiming for at that point. It's a very complicated city.
Which makes it all the more intriguing. Now, the other aspect that I'd like, if we can, to talk a little bit about Aldo is his former work as a mercenary. And I just wondered that, again, you know, a sword for hire, as it were, and then, you know, and then being part of the authorities. How did that happen? You know, that being, you know, being out there and then being inside. How did you get him to move from one space one space of action to another space.
Yeah, I mean, of course, at this point, before I had to start studying all of this in order to write the book, I, in my head, just imagined that everybody had always had armies forever and ever, amen, and they all had uniforms and turned up and fought their battles. And of course, nothing was further from the truth. At this point in Italy wasn't even Italy at this point. It was just a series of city-states and warring provinces and all sorts going on. So if to raise an army, you basically had to pay an army to raise an army, and they tended to be mercenaries were the best armies that you had. So whoever had the most money got the best mercenaries, therefore tended to win the battles, unless they were strategic geniuses. Now Aldo, when he's sort of 18 and he becomes a mercenary, he leaves the city for reasons we discover in book 2. He ends up riding with a man who was known as Giovanni of the Black Band, because him and his men always used to wear a black ribbon tied around their arm, who was actually from the Medici, but from a sort of obscure part of the Medici, very complex family tree. And Giovanni he was a mercenary, and he what's called a condottieri, so he was a leader of men, a leader of soldiers. But he was very unusual in that he believed in the nobility of warfare. He often refused to be paid for what he did. He would accept payment and then he would give it all to his men. He often fought on the losing side of battles because he believed in the cause. So he wasn't simply fighting for money and for his own glory. So he became quite a folk hero in Tuscany during this period, and got wounded. I think they had to amputate part of his leg, and he died of gangrene soon afterwards. And thus leaving his wife, Maria Salviati, as a widow, and their son, Cosimo de' Medici, who was, I think, 7 or 8 at the time, basically, fatherless and left in the countryside. And then the character of Cosimo will eventually rise up, as we discover in City of Vengeance, and at the age of 17 rises to prominence. And I'll say no more because it was spoiling the story, but becomes a significant character, as does his mother, Maria, who was quite the character, judging by the historical records. I even found a translation of a letter that she wrote in sort of 1531 to her brother or her cousin, saying why she certainly was not going to remarry, and not to some fat old man who smelled a lot. Very modern her language was, it has to be said. She was quite forthright in her views. So Aldo rode with this folk hero mercenary. And I think that certainly influenced his worldview, in that he believes in protecting those who can't protect themselves. And he's not completely self-serving. He doesn't just serve himself. He actually tries to, do some good in the world. And he's very cynical about the fact of things, and he's quite existential in that he knows that he's never going to solve the system. He's never going to change the city or anything else, but he believes Florence is a city which he loves, is worth saving. So when he was a mercenary for a time, and then so he rode with Giovanni, and then he became injured, and it wasn't practical for him to continue as a mercenary. So he returned to Florence and was like, well, I've got a certain bunch of skills. What am I going to do with this now? And became a constable, which leads to him becoming an officer of the court. And it was one of the things that was, I went to the Harrogate Crime Festival in 2016 when I was getting ready to start writing the book. And I remember Abir Mukherjee was on Val McDermid's New Blood panel that year. And he was talking about A Rising Man, the first of his Wyndham and Surrender Not series. And it was Banerjee. And he was talking about how Sam Wyndham is a good man fighting for a bad system. He's a good man who works for a corrupt, oppressive colonial regime, effectively. And when he said that, there was a light bulb went off above my head. And I went, and I could see, yes, Aldo's a bit like that, in that he's, the system of justice is to a large extent bought and sold in Renaissance Florence. The amount of money you have determines how much, if any, time you spend in jail for your crimes, or if you even get accused of them or not, because you can buy your way out of most things, or you can use your power and influence to maneuver your way out of escaping justice. whereas the poor people always end up with the wrong end of the stick in such things. History continues.
Yeah.
So it was, I thought when Abir said that, and I went, yes, and I can see how in some ways Cesare Aldo is a little like that. And it's not that he's a completely good man. He's willing to do quite ruthless things in order to preserve his own life. But in order to protect others, he's willing to push things to their limit as well. So there's a little bit of that. So that was one of the moments of inspiration as I was preparing to start writing City of Vengeance. So that's why I love Aldo as a character, because I'm never quite sure how far he's willing to go, and quite who he's willing to stick the knife into if he really has to. If you put Aldo into a corner, there will be blood, is generally how it operates.
I think that's why I like him. That idea of what he is willing to fight for. It's one of the aspects that I really like about this character. Now, so book one is available, City of Vengeance. Just because of where we're at in these most unusual of times, bookstores in Scotland will be opening very soon, and
Yes.
I just wondered, because I know you're based in Edinburgh, and I just wondered if you wanted to give a shout out, if you had a favorite bookstore in Edinburgh that will be stocking City of Vengeance.
Oh well, there's three I have to give a shout out to.
Please do, yeah.
Because when we did the launch for City of Vengeance, obviously it was entirely online. So I was lucky enough. I was the first event of the year for the We Three Indies, which is 3 bookshops that banded together during lockdown to stage digital events together. So it's the Edinburgh Bookshop in Brunsfield, which is literally around the corner from the campus where I teach when we get back to teaching face to face, because we're at sort of we're at Brunsfield, sort of Morningside, next to Holy Corner, for those people who know Edinburgh, and that's where the Edinburgh Bookshop is. So they're one of the We Three Indies. Far From the Madding Crowd, and then Lithgow is another one of the We Three Windies, and they just won Independent Scottish Bookshop of the Year.
Wonderful.
And then the third bookshop is Atkinson Price Bookshop in Biggar, which is actually where I live. I live south of Edinburgh. So they're also a past winner of Scottish Independent Bookshop of the Year, as is Edinburgh Bookshop, of course. So the We Three Indies have been, they did a launch for City of Vengeance, which was wonderful. We got, I don't know, over 100 people from around the world turned up for the digital launch, and Ian Rankin lurking in the background, which is always nice of Ian. So they've been really big supporters for the book, and I still haven't been to Far From the Madding Crowd. I'm waiting for lockdown to end. So I think as of next week, I should be able to go and visit glamorous Linlithgow. I've never been. I have no idea whether it's glamorous or not.
It's lovely. Honestly, it's lovely. I have a friend who has a sister who lives there. But yeah, so yes, please, yeah, it's lovely. I shall be, when they open up on the 26th, I shall be popping to the Edinburgh Bookshop, which is just on the corner from where I am, and because I want my mum to read your book, and my mum doesn't read online. She likes a page to turn, so I shall be popping for a copy, and that'll wing its way to Wales. David, sadly, there's so much more that I could and want to ask you, but I'm hoping that for book 2, you do us the honours of being back on here again.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. But for now, really, really grateful that you've been able to come on and talk to us about City of Vengeance. And like I say, for those who haven't had a chance, I really hope that's whetted your appetite to get hold of a book that I know you will lose yourself in, and come up against characters that are so intriguing and so exciting. For now, David, I wish you all the very best, and no pressure for book 2, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'll just pop behind the screen now, shall I?
Yes, please, if you would. Thank you, David. Thank you.